Is ChatGPT4 the beginning of the end for humanity? Well, it's an extreme statement. Sam Harris seems to think there's more short-term risk than many people realize. I'm Christopher Lind. Professionally, I'm a tech analyst, advisor, and HR exec. Personally, I'm a husband, father of 7, and I live life at the intersection of business, tech, and human experience. And this week, I'm going to be responding to a recent interview that was hosted by Stephen Bartlett. He has a podcast called Diary of a CEO. It's a podcast that is definitely worth checking out. While I don't listen to all of them, there are a number of them that I find really interesting. And actually, a few months back, I did a response to Mo Gaudat, who was a Google AI exec, and he shared his thoughts on the risks of AI. And I did a response to that. I thought I'd do another one of these to Sam's conversation with Stephen, because Sam was coming at it through the lens of a philosopher and neuroscientist. So he had a different angle on this conversation, which I thought was really interesting. And it was also really interesting as I listened to the whole conversation to hear where we aligned and where we differed. And while there were some things that I think played into that, I think we have two very different worldviews, which is contributing to that. But overall, it's why I really enjoy listening to diverse perspectives. So if you have not seen this whole conversation, I will tell you it's a long one. It is a 2-hour interview. So if you choose to check it out, be sure to block off some time. I did include a link to it in the comments. There are some areas where it winds around quite a bit, and it's not really all about artificial intelligence as the title would suggest, but that really is the red thread that runs through that whole conversation. And I would say it's some advice at the end, which isn't necessarily specific to AI. It is bang on. So I'm not going to spoil that now, but you'll see as I get into that. So the goal of this is really to break this conversation down, add some perspective, add some additional things. I will be showing clips of it throughout so you can see parts of it. I'm not intending to try and snip and only show parts to kind of make a point, so much as to highlight some of the discussion points that I have. There were 6 big themes that I saw in this conversation that really jumped. And one is the idea that superhuman advanced general intelligence, this AGI, this cognizant, sentient AI, really is an end objective. And that's inevitable. Unless some sort of cataclysmic event, meteorite, something blows up the earth, nuclear war, unless something like that happens, it is where we're going. That was a big theme that came out. And what I agreed with in there, and you'll see as we get into it, that doesn't matter if you're pro or anti-AI. Everyone seems to unite behind this. And some of those things came through in this conversation. I think another thing that really stood out in here through the conversation was the fact that increased intelligence doesn't equal greater morality or an increase in ethics. And you'll see that through some of the points that happen in the conversation. Another big one that they spend a lot of time unpacking, and I'll spend some time here myself, is this short-term risk of misinformation and misunderstanding. This is a huge risk that they dive into, and I will share my thoughts on that as we get into it. They talk about that at length. Where this is going, I really thought that Sam had some great perspective on this in terms of making us more human. It's a shared view that we had on this. I will say it was interesting hearing he and Stephen go back and forth on some of the things, which I'll break down in my breakdown of the video. The other theme that came in was this idea of, if we could stop, should we? It's a question that gets asked that they unpack. I really enjoyed listening to where they went with it, and I will share some of my own thoughts on that. And then the 6th theme that really was through this all was at the end, and this all leads up to this whole thing, because so much of this conversation is, where's the world going? And towards the end, they talk about, how do we be happier amidst all of this? And I thought what Sam had to share on that was fantastic. So if you're the type that skips around through a conversation, you can skip. I have this all organized by chapters, so you can go through it and find all the details there and see, you can go ahead and read the end and then come back to the rest if you want. But those are the big themes in there. So where I want to start, though, in this. And like I said, there are some things. So if you see me looking around, some of it is me, looking at actually sharing some stuff as we go into this. But one of the things that they talked about was this idea of why lower intelligence puts you at a disadvantage. And I thought it was interesting the way they framed it up. I'll share some of my thoughts on what that looks like, but let me just play the clip for you that to me I think articulates this really well.
Now, it's true that the the mismatch in our intelligence dictates a fundamental blindness with respect to what we've become in the meantime, right? So like, we have all these instrumental goals and things we care about that they cannot possibly conceive, right? They know that when we go get the leash and say it's time for a walk, they understand that
And here he's
particular part of
talking
the language
about
game.
dogs and the
But everything
relationship of
else we
dogs
do
and
when we're
people.
talking to each other, when we're on our computers or on our phones, they don't have the dimmest idea of what we're up to. And if something happened, we love, the truth is we love our dogs. We make just irrational sacrifices for our dogs. We prioritize their health over all kinds of things that is just amazing to consider. And yet, if we learned, if there was a new, global pandemic kicking off and some xenovirus was jumping from dogs to humans, and it was just kind of super Ebola, right? It was 90% lethal. And this was just a forced choice between them. What do you value more, the lives of your dogs or the lives of your kids, right? If that's a situation we were in, it's totally conceivable. I mean, it's not not by no means impossible. We would just kill all the dogs, right? And they would never know why, right? We would just.
So I'm going to stop it there because I think that highlights really the main point that they were talking about this, and the whole idea that Sam's getting at through this conversation about dogs and people is this idea that humans are significantly more intelligent than dogs. And he's using this on analogy to AI being like people and us being like dogs, and that ultimately this massive intelligence and why this is such a risk, because at some point, this lack of knowledge, if all of a sudden the machines make this decision and decide, you know what, we have to pick and choose, people aren't worth it anymore, it's just going to do it and we're not going to have a clue. And underneath all of this is a bit of a worldview that knowledge is really the ultimate when it comes to power and things like that, which I think there was some real truth to it. And so as he was talking about it, he goes into it at length. And like I said, there's a lot of stuff. I couldn't show the whole clip because it goes in circles quite a bit. But the thing with it that I thought was interesting is there is some truth to that. I definitely agree that this idea that, having a higher degree of intelligence does put you at an advantage in some regards for things. Where I think I diverge a bit on his thinking around this is the fact that, yes, I agree there is value in intelligence, but where I think, and I talked about this in my Mo Gaudat conversation, he neglects to recognize that there is a significant difference between wisdom and intelligence, and that you can be highly intelligent and at the same time be a complete fool. And we all know those people who have great deals of intelligence. They are super smart, all this stuff. And yet they make just these confounding mistakes and things like this. And so as he's talking about this whole risk associated with it, he's talking about the risk that comes with artificial intelligence having just this ridiculous level of intelligence in it and what a disadvantage it puts us at. That's where I would say I don't know that I would go that far with it, in the sense that, yes, I think these machines are going to be hyper intelligent. And if you've played around them at all, you can see how quick they are and how quickly they can move. And we are only in their infancy. Yet, if you spent much time around these things, you also know how stupid they are as well. And so when I think about this, my personal take on this is, as I look at where AI is going and the more time I spend with artificial intelligence, do I see there being risks with machines that maybe are vastly more intelligent than us? Yes, in the sense, like, I do agree with him that there's the possibility they could come to conclusions that we don't even understand and make decisions vastly outside our range of understanding. And that puts us at a disadvantage. Yes, but not in this all-encompassing way that if we could only reach that intelligence, then we could compete. I think in many ways, the wisdom that we as people have, and again, this goes back to a worldview, where, biblically I'm looking at it as wisdom starts with the fear of the Lord, that whole thing, there's more to it than, and the question becomes, can machines be wise? And this, you'll see as they get into it later, when we get into some of the ethics things, this is where some of that starts to fall apart, is this idea of, well, is hyperintelligence really making us more wise, more ethical? Not necessarily. And so some of the fear that I see, and I don't know if it's necessarily fear that he's sharing, but there's definitely concern that he has with this idea of hyper intelligent machines, vastly, vastly more intelligent than we are. And that just inevitably that puts us at a huge disadvantage. And I don't know that I give it the same weight of it being a disadvantage. Is it a disadvantage? Yes. Is it an unsurmountable disadvantage that we can't overcome? I don't know that I would go that far, which is a difference that I would say the two of us had when I was listening to this. And if you listen to the whole thing, you'll hear some of the implications that come along with that. Now, the other thing that jumping to another part of the conversation that he brings up that I thought was really interesting was some of the things he talked about when it came to how different the intelligence is. And one analogy he brings up is, if we were told an alien life form was coming to Earth in, I think he said 50 years, but we all know AI is coming a heck of a lot faster than that. He talked about how people would be freaking out, just completely freaking out. And yet many people know this hyperintelligence AI stuff is coming, and they're seeing it, they're experiencing it, they're doing all these things. And people in many regards are kind of like, not concerned. And before I get into where he goes with that and where we diverge a bit, because he said it's shocking to him. He talks about the fact he's very surprised because, putting those two analogies together, if we were told these aliens were coming, it would completely destroy us. People would be panicking and there would be sheer chaos everywhere. And yet we know basically that's what's happening with AI, and yet we're doing nothing. One of the other things he brought up that I thought, as he's kind of showing how different these things are, that I thought was a really interesting analogy. Let me share this one with you as well that comes in, where he talks about this intelligence difference between AI and us. And I think this little clip does a really good job of explaining why these machines are so intelligent, which then you'll see how this ties to this whole, if people knew this about aliens coming and they could travel light years, they'd be freaking out. So let me play this part.
Is just a phantasmagorical difference in capacity. Just imagine we had 10 smart guys in a room over there, and they were working and thinking and talking a million times faster than we are. Right. Well, so they're no smarter than we are, but they're just faster. And we talk to them once every 2 weeks just to catch up on, what they're up to and what they want to do and whether they still want to collaborate with us. Well, 2 weeks for us is 20,000 years of analogous progress for them. So how could we possibly hope to constrain the opinions and collaborate with and negotiate with people no smarter than ourselves, who are making 20,000 years of progress every time we make 2 weeks of progress? Right? It's just it's unimaginable, and yet there are many people that just think this is just fiction. Everything all the noises I've made in the last 5 minutes are just like a new religion of fear, right? And it's just, there's no reason to think that alignment is even a potential problem.
If your intuition is correct.
Okay. So you can see where he's going with this. And this really ties between these two things, one that I shared before and now this other alien component, where you can see, and the way he showcases that, I think really does highlight why there is area for concern around artificial intelligence, specifically on the intelligence side. So in that analogy of, well, if you had two people of equal intelligence, but one just moved 20,000 times faster, regardless if one was smarter than the other, one would just be so much further ahead that you wouldn't even be speaking the same language in terms of your understanding and comprehension. And so this ties back to this whole, why are people not freaking out about it when we know this stuff is even more intelligent than people and it's moving this much faster? So how much more, fearful should we be? Now, the part that I agree with him on completely, well, a couple things. So one, I agree with his point that yes, there is definitely call for concern. And if you've watched any of my content, you know that I'm not sitting here saying, hey, we have nothing to be worried about. There's nothing to be concerned about. Let's just move on and pay no attention to what's happening. I think there are definitely things that we should be paying attention to and mindful of with all of this. But going back to the wisdom thing, I don't know that we need to be quite as fearful as some folks are, because really at the end of the day, the thing I'm almost more concerned about than the technology as itself is the people behind that thing making these decisions. And that's where I think you'll see when we get to the next chunk some of the things that we really need to be mindful of. But as we look at some of this stuff, going back to his thought of, he was struggling in that part of the conversation. He was struggling to understand why people just are dismissing this whole thing as, wow, this is just the next fear narrative. All this is designed to do is freak people out and all of this. And I was actually surprised he didn't go here, especially as a neuroscientist spending as much time in cognitive psychology, is just the fact we see this all the time with people. It's not surprising to me that people aren't really all that freaked out, that people aren't really, doing much about it, because one, I don't think people really know what to do with it. Secondly, in many regards, people are seeing a lot of the positive side of it, or seemingly positive side, and aren't really paying attention to the risks. And this is just human behavior in general. To his analogy in the video where he talks about if there was an announcement that aliens of this hyper intelligence, they could travel light years, imagine how much more powerful and smart they are coming in 50 years, we'd just be in sheer panic. I agree that that would probably happen initially. And we haven't seen that with AI very much. I think many people have been very dismissive of some of the risks, which I think is not a good thing. But ultimately, I think if we were to look at that same scenario, let's say alien invasion, super beings coming to planet Earth type of a thing, I actually think if we knew that was coming, we'd see people fall into the same state that they're falling into now with artificial intelligence, especially if that alien race was sending snack bags and other things to us. And we're going, hey, like maybe this isn't really all that bad anyway. I'm seeing a lot of good. We as a society just are not good at evaluating the risks that are past the end of our nose. I mean, that's just human behavior. We tend to panic. And then once we realize, oh, maybe it's not quite as bad as I thought, we just fall back into a lull of complacency. And so I was a little surprised by, as much time as they spent going back and forth on kind of the fear that we probably should have. I would almost say there's a fear in terms of like a healthy respect that we should have for it. I don't know that I go quite as far as Sam does in terms of where he's going with this idea that these hyper intelligent machines are just going to be able to completely vanquish us type of a thing. I think, again, going back to what I said earlier, I think there's just such a difference between intelligence and wisdom that I don't know that I see it quite through the same lens that he is in all of that. But it was a really interesting part as they dug through that. And I really do think the idea that there is such a huge distinguishment in where these machines will be compared to where we are. But with that, as they furthered into it, one of the things that I will call out that I very much agree with that Sam spent a lot of time talking about was the idea that just because we have higher intelligence does not mean the ethics and morals are going to come along for the ride. And going back to some of the right risks that I think he raises, that is absolutely one. I think there is a risk of people starting to view AI almost as a savior. You can have a bit of a savior complex with it, where you can start to see it as the solution to everything. And it's going to, and you can over index on this. I get there's the fear mongering on the one side saying this is going to be the beginning of the end. But I think on the other side, you can take this and start to think that this will be the solution to all of our world's problems. We'll be able to fix absolutely everything with the world simply by intelligence, which I actually thought it was interesting that given where Sam Harris is coming from, I've done a little bit of research into his background and just some of his worldview. I'm actually surprised that that's not an area of conflict for him, that, the whole ethics side that he wouldn't naturally assume that it would come along with intelligence, which I thought was really balanced as a philosopher. He recognizes that just because we get smarter and smarter and smarter, and even if these machines get smarter and smarter and smarter, he's not using the word wisdom, but the ethics and the morals that come along don't necessarily come along for the ride. And I think that is an area of risk that we have to be hyper aware of. Is these technologies, these large language models that we're looking at right now, they are trained on human data, which, yes, efforts have gone in to try and add a degree of morality into it and things like that. But who's defining what that is? What degree are they, cross-checking this? All these different questions that need to be asked. And that's not only the models themselves and what ultimately they end up doing, but then you also have to layer on the complexity of the ethics and the morals of, well, who's making decisions on what to do with these models and these tools and these technologies. So there's actually almost a two-factor authentication we need to consider when it comes to this. There's the first one, which is, are we authenticating that there's a strong degree of ethics and morals in the technology itself, the language models and the technologies, the data it's training on, all these things? How are we making sure that that's secure? And then how is there that second layer of security that says, okay, but then what's catching anything that gets missed, to make sure that as we look at how we use this tech and what this tech really is and how it's, what potential it brings, what that could do for us. So a lot of really thoughtful things being discussed in there, but those are a lot of the questions that I have running through my head right now. And really this idea of this two-factor authentication, how are we going to get around that as it comes to artificial intelligence? And I've talked to some folks who have some really good thoughts around it. There are some efforts that are starting to be treaded into with it, but this is largely still one of the greatest areas of opportunity when we think about this technology. Is who gets to decide that, and how are we being sure that there's effective and meaningful layers of protection being put in place on some of this stuff? So that's where we get to that point. As we transition from this is where Sam goes into, because as you can see from the previous parts of the conversation, they're talking about, this hyper intelligence, the risk of annihilation and all this other stuff. And then the conversation transitions because Stephen's pushing him on a couple of these different things. And Sam actually transitions to the shorter term concerns that he has around artificial intelligence. And I thought the way he brought it up was really great. So I'm actually just going to bring that in here and play a little part of this.
Well, I'm as interesting as I think that problem is, and consequential as it is, I'm worried that life could become unlivable in the near term before we even get there. Like, I'm just worried about the misuses of narrow AI in the meantime. I'm worried about, just take the current level of AI we have. We have GPT-4. I think within the next 12 months or 2 years, let's say whatever GPT-5 is, we're going to be in the presence of something where most of what's online that purports to be information could soon be fake, right? Where just most of the text you find on any topic is just fake, right? Like, someone has just decided, write me 1,000 journal articles on why mRNA vaccines cause cancer, and give me 150 citations. Write them in the style of Nature and Nature Genetics and Lancet and JAMA, and just put them out there, right? Right. One teenager could do that in 5 minutes with the right AI. Right? It's just like we're not, GPT-4 is not quite that, but GPT-5, possibly will be that. It's like that is such a near-term advance, right? Or just when you imagine knitting together.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it there, but I really appreciated him digging into that short-term risk with some of the AI tools that are out there today, and hopefully hearing him break it down that way helps you start to see some of the realistic and very short-term risks that are coming with this. So, and this has long-term implications all the way on a lot of things as you think about this, because it's not even just, the example he gave, let's say somebody just wanted to spin up and create 1,000 different white papers on a certain topic, which, by the way, happens all the time right now. The ability to create misinformation at scale, and he says it, a high schooler, middle schooler, or whatever, could do this with the right AI model in a couple of hours. And that is absolutely 100% accurate. And again, while it might not quite be there yet, we are on the precipice of that kind of power. And that's why you're hearing some of the things and some of the concerns and even some of the potential legal ramifications that are coming back on unleashing this technology on the world without really thinking through some of these longer term implications. I mean, his concern about the fact that all the information you encounter, you are going to have to question whether that's even real anymore. And what does that do to the world? I mean, you think about the fact that in just a few months, election season is starting. And the idea that these AI models already are at a point where creating misinformation on mass scales is completely plausible. It's not a stretch to think that anybody who really has nefarious purposes could sit and do this. And it could put everyone in, I think, the way Sam describes it, you could send someone into a conspiracy cult for the rest of their life, which is truly a state of psychosis where you just are finding everything you want to believe about the world, and it just leads you into utter madness. And the reality is, something that I think is really important for us to think about. It is so much easier to break things than it is to fix them. And when we start thinking about, what these things look like before we just unleash them on the masses, I mean, there is some really, really, really short term. And then I'm going to talk about the long term things with this. But, short term, misinformation is going to be everywhere. I just think of a story. I recently did a Learning Tech Talks where I was talking with somebody in the cybersecurity thing, and I was talking to them about, just some of the practical risks that this misinformation is going to start creating. If you're not familiar with some of these applications of technology, like you can create a computer generated copy of someone's voice. It sounds almost identical to them, actually indistinguishable, unless you know the person and really know the nuance of the way they say things and how they say things. You wouldn't be able to detect a difference. And on that, we talked about the fact that just simple best practice is, hey, how do you combat this? And our whole thing was, if you get a call from someone, sounds a little odd, say, can I call you right back? And I'm not kidding you, less than a week later, someone reached out to me and it had happened to them. And they remembered my conversation and saying, that's what you need to do. And they did it. And it prevented them from being, taken advantage of, because they went, wait a minute, something smells fishy about this. Can I call you right back? And they called their, this person back, and they're like, what are you talking about? I didn't just call you. So living in a world where we have to question everything, near term is real. So there are some really practical things from an education standpoint that I think if you're a learning leader, you need to be cognizant of this. If you're a parent, you need to be cognizant of this. But if you're just a human being on this planet, we need to be aware of the fact that misinformation is going to be coming at us faster than we know what we can do with. And it's going to become a lot harder to find what is true and what is right on the internet. And even in relationships, because people are going to be consuming all this misinformation and going back to living in a cult of conspiracies and going into a state of madness, it's going to become more difficult to go, well, wait a minute, how do you distinguish what is real and what is not anymore? And that's right around the corner. If we aren't already in those days now, we are not far from them. And like I said, I don't have a good solution to this other than, as a learning leader and as dad of 7, how do we educate people to know how to handle this and what are good practices for identifying, and you'll see where this is going later on, but there's a lot of things that this has long-term implications and short-term implications. Some of the longer term implications though, that I think really come up. Well, and so short term, this need for educating people on what the risks are, and even teaching people basic things like, breaking down arguments and understanding how to detect fallacies and how to detect real information and distinguish it from fake information, and how to challenge your own assumptions and be aware of your own biases. And I mean, all of these things are going to become critical skills just to survive anymore. You're going to have to be able to navigate that and be able to distinguish and question and look at things and look objectively. And I mean, this is very, very, very real. Now, what's interesting about that, though, is that requires space. And one of the things that Sam talked about in here that I thought was really good, just as a practical implication that anybody can do today, is giving yourself more space between reacting. So in the podcast, he talks about why he deleted Twitter. And it wasn't just that it was this place of angry, extremes, but the fact that Twitter was an enabler for him to not think critically on things, because when he saw something, he could react and then boom, and do something with it. And so he deleted Twitter because it forced him to take more time to process. And so now he has days to think. And so when he sees something, when he hears something, he has to think and process it for a few days before he decides, am I going to do a podcast on this or am I not? And I can say from my own story, intentional space in between reactions is a very practical way to help you break through some of this misinformation, because it actually gives you time to process your own emotions, your own feelings, your own reactions, to actually weigh the validity of what you're reading and what you're doing. And the problem is, when you don't have that space, not only is it not good for you, because you amp yourself up on some of these things and you end up flying off the handle. And pretty soon you start cognitively convincing yourself of the very things that are amping you up, and it becomes cyclical in nature. So not only is that super dangerous, but when you don't have that space to react, you take your own reactions to things, which, again, you think about this, everything in the future, it's going to be almost indistinguishable what's true and what's not. You now are spreading it at a rate that is now putting other people in jeopardy, because you're now taking this and you're putting that in their lap, and you're taking your reactional and your emotional response, something, and you're throwing it in someone else. And now you're creating that very same environment for them. And they may not have the coping mechanisms or the infrastructure in place, the securities in place to help protect them from that. And so as we think about caring for each other, I thought Sam's advice of finding space and being intentional about creating space before reacting is going to be critical, not only for your health and well-being, but in being kind and loving to other people, because we are going to just continue to be on this path of continuous outrage over things that we know now we aren't even going to know if they're true or not. And I think this is a way that we can practically create space to be able to start to do some of these things, to deconstruct the argument, assess the source, assess our own biases, and then actually do good for us, but also do good for others, as we prevent us from throwing things in other people's lap when they aren't even ready for it. So that's a long little bit on kind of this whole misinformation thing, but those are some of the shorter term things that are on my mind that I'm thinking about, that I'm looking at help solve for myself and for others. But one of the other things that they didn't dig into on this very much, that I spend a lot of time thinking about right now, is, yes, we're talking about all this misinformation, and yes, short term, we're going to need to get better at diagnosing, what's real, what's not, how do we assess all this stuff. But as the ocean fills with more stuff that's triggering us to have to question and dive into this whole, well, is this real? Is this not real? I can't help but think about the longer term implications on trust and what that really means for people to live in a world where you can't trust anything, and everything you see and hear, you have to question. And even if you have all the coping mechanisms and all the tools in place to do that well, what does the continued exposure to that actually mean? And what is that actually going to do to us? And how do we deal with that? Now, granted, again, coming from a very different worldview, for me, I rest in the fact that scripture, from my worldview, doesn't change. It is truth with a capital T and all of these things. And so as I think about, well, what can I really trust? For me, there's something to go back to. As I think about this for Sam, and I don't know where Stephen is, I don't know what they go back to. And I don't know what people who don't have that capital T, what do you go back to give you some sense of a stable foundation? And what is being faced constantly with the fact that you are sitting on shifting sand? What does that do to a person? I don't know. But to me, this is a longer term effect that concerns me a lot, because I'm very concerned what constantly being pressed with questioning literally everything, everyone, everything you read, every conversation you have, what does that do to somebody? What kind of psychological effect does that have? What kind of effect does that have on the relationships that we have with other people? And it's not even just the people that people need to be able to trust, but that the institutions, we're in an age where we question every institution. And as a result, we've seen that now we just hand everything over to the individual. We don't trust the institution, but anybody who seems like a reasonable, trustworthy person, we'll give them a platform, and then we'll trust that. But as we start creeping into the age of, okay, well, but now that's going to start falling apart, because how do we know that even what they're saying isn't built on misinformation and it can be trustworthy? Without that capital T, I am very concerned for what will happen and the effect that that's going to have on people. And if we have seen anything, COVID and what happened over the past few years with that was a bit, I think the way Sam said it in the podcast, it was a dress rehearsal for what AI is going to bring to the table. And if that was a dress rehearsal, let me just say that was a dumpster fire. How the past few years have played out and what it has done to dividing people, what it's done to tribalism, to making people believe things regardless of any sort of truth or evidence that's presented to them, because it goes against the tribe or wherever they're standing. It's concerning, because if that's just the dress rehearsal and we're about to turn the volume up to 11, we have some very concerning years ahead of us. And that's not doomsday propaganda. That's not me saying, oh no, the end of the world is here. But it is me saying that I think folks who do not have that capital T, who do not have something grounding them that is not going to be persuaded by misinformation and AI that gets thrown around and all these other things, I am concerned. I am very concerned when folks don't have that. And what will that constant shifting sand do to people? And where do we go from there? And I think one of the things that came out in this conversation that I don't agree with is Sam talked a little bit about needing to rely on our own intuition and needing to be more grounded in our own self and things like that. And the example he used in there was, he talked about an example where, AI had detected nuclear launch missiles being launched, and it had prompted this general to, respond back, and his own gut intuition and just analyzing the situation, he went, this isn't a real launch. This is something else. I can tell, because if they would have launched more. He came to the right conclusion, and he went against what the AI recommended, thank goodness, type of a thing. And so his point in all that was, this is going to drive us to lean into needing to lean more into our own intuition and all these other things. And that to me was very concerning. And I'm not just saying that because of my worldview, but I'm just saying that because of my own assessment of myself. I am a terrible I would not trust myself to be the capital T in my life, which culturally, that is very much how we are pushing people. And what we're telling people to do is, well, just believe in yourself, trust yourself, go with your own intuition, go with your gut. If you can just figure out yourself enough, that'll be a good guide. And I can tell you from my own personal life experience, if I trusted myself, I would have made some very, very, very stupid decisions. And I still made a lot of stupid decisions. And usually the stupid decisions I made were when I said, yeah, well, everything's telling me this, but you know what? In my gut, I feel like this is the right thing to do. And I've gone against all the wisdom that I had coming from other sources. And so I think that was one of the cautionary things that I would say that I would disagree with Sam on this. Was his solution to it is, well, you just need to, teach yourself enough, educate yourself enough, build enough intelligence internally. And again, if this isn't exactly the view he has, that was the view I gathered from the whole conversation, was that if you can just figure this out for yourself, you're just going to need to trust in yourself. And I would vehemently disagree with that. Both practically speaking, I would not just trust myself in a vacuum just based on what I know about myself. And then I stack on top of that my biblical worldview. And I would say, no, I think trusting yourself is a very dangerous thing to do amidst all of this. So that was one thing. But again, I think the longer term implications on trust, and that's a part that they didn't dive into as much as I would have loved to be in the room and ask some of those questions, some of the questions that I'm discussing here, hear how Sam would respond to some of those things, get Steven's perspective as well. But I think that to me is almost the bigger, longer term concern I have around this soon to be just massive influx of false, misleading, extremely biased information being flooded out there. And then on top of it, what that looks like further downstream. Because when you think about all these machines, all these large language models today, they didn't just come up with this stuff from itself, it learned from other things. And so as you think about this age of misinformation, if all of a sudden the world is generating massive quantities of misinformation and everything could potentially be misinformation, what's then training the future AI? And how we're already struggling with managing, how do we build morals and ethics, and how do we filter what needs to be filtered out of these things? We start moving into an age where literally everything could be wrong. How do you even do that? I don't know that I've heard a good answer to that. I honestly don't know that I've heard a good answer for how we can do that, other than, well, we just won't use any information from the future. But first of all, the train's left the station on that one. And, I just don't see that being a solution to things. I don't have a good answer to that, but I'm very curious, not only this whole trust and the impact it's going to have on mankind and humanity, but also what does that even mean for the future of AI? If everything is misinformation or potentially misinformation, how does it even start to filter it out of the system when it just becomes so ubiquitous? It's impossible to distinguish. So anyway, there was that. Now, that's kind of the dark side of the conversation, where it went, down a dark path. But there was a positive side in terms of the hope that comes from this. So let me share this little section here.
That is, and I think other people have echoed this of late. I mean, it's sort of surprising to me. I mean, my answer is that this begins to privilege a return to the humanities as a kind of a core, like the center of mass intellectually for us. Because when you look at what we're really good at, and it's among the last things that can be plausibly automated. And if we automate it, we may cease to care about it. So it's like learning to write good code is something that is going to be, it's being automated now. It is, I'm not a programmer, but I have it on good authority that already these large language models are improving code, and something like half the time they're writing better code than people. That's all going to become like chess, right? It's going to be better than people ultimately. Um, so being a software engineer is something that, and being a radiologist and being like those things, it's easy to see how AI just cancels those professions, or at least makes one person, so effective at using AI tools that, one person can do the work of 100 people. So that you got 99 people who don't have to be doing that job. Um,
All right, so I'm going to stop it there because what I thought, there were a couple things that stood out on this. And one, I am very much in alignment with Sam on this, that I think where this is going to go is going to push us to be more human. And I think that's one of the most exciting parts about what artificial intelligence is going to do potentially, is to encourage us to focus on. And I talk a lot about this in the HR and skills space, that the skills that are going to rise to the surface are going to be the human skills, the skills where people are really leaning into their human capacity and what all that looks like. I think his point of things like a coder or a radiologist, do they go away completely, or do they just change to the point where there's only a need for one because one can do the work of 100? Yeah, I think that's a real risk. And when I talk a lot about what it looks like as work changes, there's a lot of implications. The thing that he said in there that I really liked was he talked about, with engineering problems, people just want it to work. They're not necessarily concerned about the beauty and the creativity that goes into it. They just want to fix a problem. And so as we think about jobs and the implications of that, as we look at jobs where it's an engineering problem or it's something just very tactical and robotic, it's going to have major implications on this, where some of those jobs, and I talk about this a lot on leadership development, being a great leader is going to be something that is going to stand the test of this. And while AI may come alongside, at the end of the day, a leader is still going to be something that stands different. Now, the thing that I thought was interesting about this is people throw this around a lot, and I don't even know that I've fully thought through my answer on this. But we say, well, the things that are distinctly human will really stand out. And it goes, but what really is that? What really is distinctively human? And I think the thing that's going to be unique about that is I think that's going to be different for a lot of different people in a lot of different situations. And one of the things in the podcast that I think highlighted this was, so Stephen pushed, they talked about, I think Stephen shared that he listened to a conversation, or maybe it was Sam who listened to a conversation. I can't remember which one did, but they listened to a conversation and it wasn't two real people. It was two artificial intelligence. They'd written a script and then they made a voice that was to sound like these two really famous people, and they did it. And whoever it was who said they listened to it just went like, I just wasn't even interested in it because it wasn't real. And the pushback to it was, well, but that's only because you knew. And I think this is where it's going to start to get really messy, because even going back to the misinformation thing, are people going to care deeply about things if they believe that they're real and they're human, but then if they find out they're not real, like a song? And they talked about this briefly, but I spent a lot of time thinking about this. If a song is created by artificial intelligence with, an artist, your favorite artist, this and that, and you love the song, but then you find out it's made by AI, how does that change it? And so what does that really look like? And I don't know that we've really spent enough time in this. I think going back to some of these things, the things that are more distinctly human, I do agree are going to rise to the top. But I think where that plays out and how can you just operate off the assumption that, well, what I do is more human, so therefore it's immune to the risk of AI? I don't think so. Because even going back to the music, there are going to be some people who are totally fine with AI created music. And there are going to be some other people who have a wonder and curiosity for music and the human interaction in this. So I don't know. And I really don't know that like I said, I don't know that we've figured out the answer to this. And I think it's also going to create new ways of doing things that we just had not imagined. I have someone that I work with who is big into creating AI art right now. And the way that this individual does it It's absolutely beautiful what they do. And I have always said that AI plus a person together will hands down always be better than either of them independent. And this is an example where this individual does this, where I go, this is totally amazing what they're able to do with these AI image generators and how they're able to take their creativity with the power and scale of artificial intelligence and create something that is truly wonderful that they wouldn't have been able to create before. And so, what does that look like in terms of, well, so will all artists be AI artists? I don't know. But I think even the fact we're spending more time thinking about that is evidence that artificial intelligence is pushing us and encouraging us to be more human. It's forcing us to think about some of these things. And I think that's a really good thing. I think the fact we're actually having to take time to think and wrestle with and work through some of this stuff, I think that in and of itself is a human capability that AI is bringing out in people that they may not even realize. And I'm very optimistic that that's going to be a really good thing. Now, where it was interesting listening to that transition and the conversation on this was they talked about the fact that one of Steven's pushbacks to Sam on this idea that, people won't be fine with this because Sam tend to take the side that, AI is just ultimately going to do so much stuff that we're going to get to a point where there's just going to be so much wealth and so much success in the system. It's going to ultimately probably lead us to needing a universal basic income and then just redistributing that wealth. And one of the things that Sam talked about was this idea that, for a while, the wealth divide is just going to get so great because there's people who are just going to be making trillions off of this stuff. And then everybody else is going to be down here. And then there's just going to be this cosmic overthrow, and then it pops, and then things kind of come back to that. But what was interesting about it, and as part of Sam's discussion going towards this, he was just talking about AI and its ability to do so much of this work and all these other things and where it goes. And Stephen pushed back. And it was interesting because he pushed back and he talked about the fact that people care and want purpose in the work that they do. And so that was Stephen's pushback to Sam's idea of AI coming for jobs and, people potentially not even needing to work anymore. And Stephen said, but I think people really find purpose in work. And what I thought that Sam said, which I agree with, is that he disagreed and he goes, but who says that purpose has to be monetary? And what was interesting is Sam ended up taking it into this realm where he started talking about the fact that, I have no doubt people are still going to work because they want to, they desire for that purpose. But what we're going to have to learn to do is how to be happy without the need to justify our value through traditional means, to find our value in something different than our monetary wealth or these other things, which is a very interesting thought experiment to go into this. But what I thought was interesting about where Sam's line of thinking with this was a couple things came out on this. Was one, the idea that survival, as in like having to fight just to exist, isn't normal. Okay. And that, we'll get to a point where we probably won't need to work for money in that true, in terms of for survival, but we'll still do it for purpose, seems to indicate that Sam would say there's some sort of greater purpose that we strive for that doesn't have to do with survival, which in some ways, if you know where he's coming from, that seems to be conflicting with what a lot of people with that worldview would say, is that, well, there is no ultimate purpose. We're just here to survive. There isn't just this identity that comes with existing as being a person. Personhood doesn't just come with some sort of identity that supersedes needing to exist, needing to survive, all of this. Now, I'm not saying that others haven't come to different conclusions, but for me, that just comes back to, well, from a biblical worldview, that's exactly what we already know, that survival isn't normal. Having to survive for your existence wasn't the original plan. We just blew it up. And I think his point of needing to get to a point where we don't justify our value and our identity based on traditional means like how much money we make, how successful we are, how popular we are. Somehow we have to get to a point where we accept that our value comes from something greater than that. For me, well, that points to a creator. Otherwise, where else would that value come from? How could you ever find satisfaction in just existing and working for the sake of purpose if there's nothing that gives that purpose? So that was the part I thought it was really interesting listening to him articulate his view on some of these points and then trying to unwind it and go, how do you, I struggled to see how you hold that view and hold to some of these other views that you have. So it was just really interesting. But again, for those who watch and think about this stuff, I think it is a very interesting space to be thinking about is if machines are able to take some of this stuff from us, what's left? I agree 100% with Stephen that there will be this, our desire for purpose, our desire to matter and have meaning and fulfillment isn't going to go away, but machines have the potential to take that away. So what does that leave you with? If you're watching or listening to this, I think that's the question that you have to ask yourself is, if all that gets taken by the machines, what are you left with? And if you don't have an answer to that, that's going to be a very frightening and terrifying future, is trying to think through, well, what does this actually mean? Where do I go from here? So anyway, a lot more. And this is where the philosophical side of Sam came out, I think, more than in other areas that I really enjoyed digging into some of this stuff. Now, one of the coming into the home stretch here, there's kind of two final things that I wanted to call attention to in the conversation. So the first was Stephen presents him with this thought experiment of, if you could hit stop on everything, would it be worth it? And this goes back to the side, the philosophical side of Sam that I really enjoyed listening to, was that question is a lot more complicated to answer than I think people realize, and I think in this binary way of thinking of, well, let's just stop AI. Stop AI. I don't even think you can. And do we even understand the implications of what we're asking if we say we want to stop AI? And could we do it even if we wanted to? But I think, the conclusion that Sam presented that I think is a wise one was going back to something I said earlier, the importance of space before just charging forward. He very much was an advocate of, I think we need more space. We need an intentional pause. We need some room to breathe and think about these implications, all these implications that I've talked about through this before we just charge forward. But I think he struggled with but would I hit stop? I don't know. I don't know that we even could. The part that he kind of hinted at that I thought was really strong was the fact that AI is simply an accelerant of what we already are going to do. So if we think about everything, you look at every example of artificial intelligence, it's not necessarily doing anything we couldn't do as people. It's simply speeding it up. So, if you think about hitting stop on artificial intelligence, I personally would say I tend to agree with Sam that I would just be more for, can we slow it down a little bit? I think we're just moving so fast. We're not even thinking through some of these existential questions we need to think through. But would we hit stop? Would it really change things? I don't necessarily know that it would. I think it would just slow things down. And so I think that's an important thing for us to consider as we look at it of, we have this urgency behind us. And I think that's one of the driving factors why we're just so determined to just hammer forward at all costs, is just this urgency of, well, but we might even, and sometimes it's positive. Well, maybe we could cure cancer. Maybe we could solve global warming. Maybe we could do all these things. We could do it by next year instead of a decade or a century from now. And those are noble and reasonable things to think about. But at the same time, it's like, but at what cost are they coming? At what cost is speeding something up that should take 100 years now taking a year? What decisions are we going to skip over? What mistakes are we going to make along the way that we wouldn't have made had we had time, going back to his space before reacting, might we avoid? And so I don't have a good answer for how we create that intentional pause, but I very much am in support of it. So, last the last thing I told you, there was the final thing that I thought was just bang on. I really, really loved how the session, it wasn't the end of it, but it was very much towards the end of it. And what that was he asked the question, and you'll hear it here. Stephen asks Sam if there was one thing that you would tell people that you could do that would make people better, happier, their well-being go up, what would it be? And I love this, so I'll just let it play.
I'm not happy. That's the signal. And I want to
Yeah.
rectify this in some way.
Yeah, well, there are a few bright lines for me. I mean, so like take our ethical lives and our relationships to other people, right? So there's the problem of individual well-being that kind of is still real, even if you're in a moral solitude. If you're on a desert island by yourself, you really don't have ethical questions that are emerging because you're not in relationship to anybody else, but you still have the problem of how to be happy. But so much of our unhappiness is in collaboration with others, right? We're unhappy in our relationships, we're unhappy professionally, and it's worth looking at how we're behaving with other people. For me, the highest leverage change I ever made, and it's very easy to spell out, and it's very clear, and ultimately it's pretty easy, is just to decide that you're not going to lie about anything, really. I mean, there might be some situations in extremis.
So there you go. Sam Harris's one tip for being happier is stop lying. And I so loved that this was, again, not the conclusion, but really towards the end of this, was kind of a capstone for me in his recommendation. And even though we have very different worldviews, I loved so much about what this is and the depth in which he talks about it. Because when we think about this, going back to what we talked about earlier with all the misinformation and what that's doing to trust, and that's not a theme in their conversation, but it's one that jumps out to me as we start dealing with misinformation and all this stuff. It starts to erode trust, and trust is at the foundation of so many different things. So when that starts falling apart, what are you left with? And telling people, just stop lying. Stop lying. Even if you think in your head, like, well, but it's for the good of someone. I'm trying to lie because I don't want to hurt their feelings, or I'm trying to do this. It really utterly destroys people when we lie about things. They prevent us from, when you think even the simplest lie, okay, just as an example here. Let's say somebody asks you, and they shared an example that was similar to this, but let's say you're talking to someone and you're sharing, they ask you about something and they ask you to do something or go somewhere or take care of something, and you can't say you can't, and then you give this seemingly innocuous reason why you can't. That's a lie. And you think, you know what, it's harmless. I just don't want to get into it with them and explain it, but I do want to give them a reason. So I'm going to give them a reason and I'm going to tell them this. You've now eroded trust, on so many levels, because one, you've now personally started to erode your own, like, well, where do I draw this line? Where do I draw the line between when I tell the truth and when I withhold the truth and when I actually just make up something completely fabricated? So you're actually kind of doing yourself a disservice. But the person you just lied to, you run the risk at some point, somebody's going to find out you told them fabricated information. And what is that doing to their relationship to you? Right. And also, what is it doing to you that you're doing this? And then even if they're accepting it, right, what is that doing to the way you think about them? How's that changing what you're, and so you got that, then you got them, they find out, now they question, well, if you lied to me about this, what else did you lie to me about, type of thing. Trust starts to go. But you even think about somebody who might overhear that, who now knows the truth and then goes, well, now I can't trust that person because if he's lied to that person, What's to stop this person from lying to me? And how do I know they haven't already? And trust just starts to just unravel in so many different ways. Now, I think this is the thing, lies prevent us from looking at who we really are. And we always justify these, say, well, I lied to them because of whatever. But you have to then go, well, okay, but why did you feel that you needed to do that? Why couldn't you just be honest? Why couldn't you just not give a reason? Why do you have to give a reason? You don't have to give everybody a reason for why you're doing something. You just say, it's not going to work for me. You don't have to tell people. There's so many things that you then have to look at yourself and go, okay, why am I filling space with inaccurate information? And just there are so many implications. I personally, in my own life, this was an area early on in my youth and growing up that it was a very difficult area for me. And I justified it for a number of reasons. It was for my own personal safety in some regards. And so then that became a pattern of behavior where that was how I protected myself. And, having finally, years later gotten out of it and going, whoa, and seeing the destruction it wreaked on my life and on the lives of others and other things. And then I see this happen in other areas and I just go, man, what wise words from Sam Harris in this. And if there were, there's a lot that you could take away from this conversation, but if there was one thing that you just actioned against and you said, you know what, man, I'm going to be more intentional about telling the truth and the positive implications that could have. And if every person made it a commitment to say, you know what, I'm going to be more honest. I'm going to be more honest. I'm not going to shroud, fabricate, mislead. I'm not going to, regardless of what it is. And even he in there gives, some examples of like, well, it might be difficult to say never, 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 never. Again, I don't know, if your spouse comes up to you and asks you, how do I look in this? And you don't think it's great, maybe, I don't know how you would work your way through that. So of course it's easy to think of all the exceptions, but I would almost encourage people rather to think through the exceptions of why that won't work, to think more on why it could and what a benefit that would be to you and also everyone. And if collectively we all made a commitment to do that, how much would that combat some of these things that came up in this interview? How much would it combat the misinformation? How much would it fight against the erosion of trust that will be caused by that? How much will it lead us to engage and be more human and vulnerable with one another because we know that we're dealing with people who are honest and trustworthy and things like that. And the implications of this are so huge. I don't even know that when Sam shared it, he realized how deep of a recommendation and an ask that this really is, and the red threads and the hooks that this has into so many other things related to the AI conversation and so much more. So with that, there is a lot more in here. This is half the length of the interview itself, but there's a lot more there that you can check out. But those really were some of the biggest things that came through. Hopefully this was helpful in highlighting some of these bigger things that were really in depth and in deep conversation. And hopefully, if anything, like I said at the end, hey, what can we do to be more trustworthy, be more honorable, be more honest with each other? And how might that positively impact the future ahead of us with AI? So with that, I'm Christopher Lind, and I will see you in the next one.